primarily একটা particular term এখানে পাওয়া যায়, বা not in the case of this particular poetry alone, but also in the other cases. Say for example, there is another particular poem that is in your syllabus, that is My Last Duchess. It's by Browning. And also the other poems that are very famous by Robert Browning, a term that is used recurringly. And the term is dramatic monologue. Now the question suddenly arises, what is dramatic monologue and how so far these are important in the patterns of writing poetry, specifically in the Victorian period or maybe in the other periods too. Now, if you break the term dramatic monologue into two, you will find two sections. So one, it is called the dramatic, and the second, it is called the monologue. Now, what happens, whenever it is the matter with the monologue, you can identify that it's a kind of an orientation that has been provided to any particular form of literature, where the speaker is single. That's why it's monologue, as you can see. Whether it is in case of a drama, we find that the protagonist or maybe the important characters, they were engaged in such a kind of monologues, delivering the monologues and so. But so far as dramatic, this particular notion is considered or concerned, we find that dramatic, this very term is actually indicating towards the dramatizing nature, where you will find the two speakers are there, they're conversing with each other. One speaker is he begins the conversation, and certainly the conversation is going on when the second speaker participates into it. That is the orientation of dramatic orientation, you see. Specifically, as the term suggests, that it is dramatic. So therefore, the conversant motive is always in work. But if you think about dramatic monologue, then certainly you will find that it is a pattern of literature where nothing related to the drama. Okay, it's a part of poetry. It's a technical term that is used to refer to poetry, the pattern of poetry. Now, what happens, that in case of Ulysses, or maybe the other poems that actually fall under this genre, we find that the speaker is single. That's why it's monologue. Then how it is dramatic? Because the conversation is not going on there, because the direct speech is from any other recipient or something you cannot get in the poem. But you can find the basic reference to a silent listener, remember. That means the poem will provide you some impression that there is the presence of a listener or maybe multiple listeners. It is true that that listener will not speak anything. Okay, the two poems that are in this particular paper, whether it is Ulysses or My Last Duchess, you will find certainly that the speaker is single, that's why it's a monologue. But you can feel the presence of another person along with the speaker. He remained a silent listener throughout, but you can feel the presence. It might be felt that there was a question that was asked by that listener to the speaker, and now the speaker is providing the kind of answer to him, to his query. But fundamentally, you will find that in spite of being present there in that particular action, if we consider the term action in case of poetry then, but he remained silent throughout the poem. That is very significant. That is very important. I will discuss on that particular feature when I will go with Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, because it is very significant and important. Here also you will find the same. I will discuss that, I will refer to that when I will go through the poem Ulysses. Now, what happens that if you think about the term Ulysses, probably it is not a new term. As a student of English literature, you know that Ulysses, this very term actually is found to be present in Homer, in Homer's work. You have gone through Iliad, though in Iliad you haven't found the name Ulysses to be specific, you have found the name of Odysseus. Now, who is Odysseus? The another name of Odysseus is Ulysses. Fundamentally, we know that so far as the Homeric epics are concerned, the two epics, the first one was Iliad, which was constructed on the fall of Ilium, that is Troy, and the second one was Odyssey, and that actually referred to the mythical journey that Odysseus actually encountered, or he had committed, while returning from the Trojan War to his native island Ithaca. Remember, Ulysses or Odysseus was the king of Ithaca. That was the name of the province where he actually was the king. Fundamentally, the whole of Odyssey was concentrated on that very journey of Ithaca, or journey of Odysseus while returning from Troy to Ithaca. These were the, a kind of adventurous tales that Odysseus had committed. Now, when you think about Ulysses, you have to consider that somehow the text has some association with Homer's Odyssey or Homer's Odysseus, because the time, the particular moment when we find the particular text is being placed, this is the time when Odysseus had returned to Ithaca from the Trojan War, and now he is considering, it is not my life. Okay? As I am a true adventurer, as I am the true warrior, so there lies no importance, there lies no glory in keeping myself within walls, within the four walls of your habitat. So we must commit a journey. We must not pause. We must not be encircled by our family members. We must not be covered by the familial obligations. We must commit a journey. The myth says, the Odyssey says, that after the commitment of the second journey, after 3 or 4 years, Odysseus died in the sea. So he never returned. So that's why when you will find that here, when Odysseus or Ulysses is preparing for another journey, when he is actually justifying his own temperament and commenting on the importance of the glory that lies beyond in the formation of adventure, in the formation of journey. Okay? This is obviously allegorically representing something extra. It is not simply considered to be a journey towards something new, a new place, a new adventure. Rather, you can also feel that it is a journey towards eternity. It is a journey towards heaven, because Odysseus never returned, remember. Here also you will find that Odysseus or Ulysses will refer to the mariners. But the myth says somehow that the mariners never returned with this Odysseus. So that is why somehow Tennyson, Lord Alfred Tennyson, he is deliberately distorting some of the basic informations that he had gathered from Homer's Odyssey. And deliberately he had done that to add an extra dimension to it. I will come to that later, because you know that the Ulysses that have been marked by Homer in his epics, the Ulysses that have been presented by Dante in his Divine Comedy, and the Ulysses that have been presented by Lord Alfred Tennyson here in this particular poem, there are some differences, okay? And we have to trace that difference, because, you know, it's a process of remythification. Though it is in the Victorian period and we know that there is another Ulysses, it will be present in front of you, that is James Joyce's Ulysses, the Stream of Consciousness novel. That will come obviously later. So therefore, in discussing on the Tennyson's poem Ulysses, we will not have to think about James Joyce's Ulysses and the pattern James Joyce is using here, because this is written much earlier than James Joyce's novel of Stream of Consciousness. So fundamentally, where lies the basic difference between Homer's Ulysses and Dante's Ulysses and the typical Victorian orientation of Ulysses that have been presented by Alfred Lord Tennyson in this particular poem? These are very significant and this is very important. I will come to that later. Before that, let us read this particular section that have been pointed out here in this particular book. It has been stated, I'm reading from that particular section, and then I will obviously tell you something about the basic orientations to it. It has been pointed out, you see, that Ulysses occupies a prominent place in Tennyson's dramatic monologue and can easily be said to be on some perspective being incorporated. Ulysses occupies a prominent place in Tennyson's dramatic monologue and can easily be said to be on of his greatest and noblest of poems. You know, in this particular reference, I must refer to another thing. At one point, you will find the poem Ulysses, which is actually indicating towards the basic impressions of journey, basic impressions of adventure. You know, the poem ends with a particular reference to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. That means that is the temperament of an adventurer. But there is another poem by Lord Alfred Tennyson, which is considered to be the poem of contrast. And whenever Ulysses is being judged, Ulysses is being compared with the next poem. It's twin poem, but obviously it's the poem of contrast. And the name of the poem is The Lotus Eaters, where the antithetical temperament is being incorporated. If Ulysses says about journey, if Ulysses comments on, you know, the adventurous journey of some people, the typical Victorian orientation of journey and explorations of new countries and new islands, then obviously you will find that Lotus Eaters is saying something different, altogether different. It is a kind of a contrast being incorporated, where the people, by eating lotus, the lotus from the Lotus Land, okay, it's a kind of a narcotic. It is not the typical lotus that we find here. But fundamentally, the Lotus Land, in the Lotus Land, from the Lotus Eaters, the mariners of Ulysses, they had tasted the lotus stem, and with its narcotic effect, they found that we will no longer roam. We will no longer move. We will live here. Because in the nature, each and everything in a single spot that takes birth, they comes to the full bloom, and each and every petal actually falls there. And fundamentally, the death comes there only. So why? Why should we toil? Why should we be committed in such a kind of an adventure? Why should we expose ourselves in different kinds of danger? So it is better to keep ourselves within these, you know, places and so. So we will no longer roam, we will no longer move. So generally that particular poem, which is a larger poem obviously regarding the length of this one, but fundamentally you will find that these two poems, Ulysses and Lotus Eaters, these are considered to be the poems of contrast. It will be better for you if you just go through the poem Lotus Eaters and then you will judge this particular poem as completely different from that one. I am not stating that without, if you read the poem Ulysses stand alone, then ultimately it will not be, it will not implicate you the actual meaning. I am not stating that, but it will be better if you read the two poems side by side, and then you will identify how the antithetical temperament of the poet is involved. So generally what I'm trying to suggest, that there is a particular entry of Dolores Bush, and it is being stated that in two areas in particular, Tennyson achieved almost unfailing felicity, the poems on classical subjects and the large body of lyrics. Now, in a modern scenario, we call it a kind of remythification. What happens, that in the reworking of myth or remythification, what you do change, certainly, that you are taking that myth, you are taking that mythical character, you are taking some of the temperaments of the character, and you just place that particular character or that particular myth in response to your own society where you are writing. Likewise, you will find that somehow the mythological character like Ulysses, the mythological character like Odysseus, it is felt through Dante. How it is working, I will come to that later. It is felt through Dante, and now it has been posited, it has been pointed by Tennyson at the backdrop of whole Victorian temperament, the whole Victorian perspectives of faith and doubt. Okay, the whole Victorian perspective of the exploring new islands and earning money from their hub. So therefore, the typical Victorian orientations of faith and doubt or explorations of new countries and new islands, all these can be classified, all these can be related with the presentation of Ulysses by Lord Alfred Tennyson. But the temperament got changed through Dante. When in Divine Comedy, specifically in case of Inferno, you will find that somehow the voyage of Ulysses had certainly got changed. The dimension, the extra dimension had been added to that. So that's why whenever we read any particular text that belongs a particular reference to the mythical past, or maybe the mythical characterization or mythical, the presentation of character, then certainly it becomes a bit tough to you, because you have to identify the basic essence of that particular character, the temperaments of the character, the patterns of the character, the patterns of the society that it represented, and how they had to some extent swayed from the main actions, and now it has been to some extent accumulating the basic essence of the present scenario. So all these have to be treated in proper way. So that's why, according to the Bush's words, it has been pointed out that somehow the poems on classical subjects and the large body of lyricism that has been originated here, these are somehow considered to be very much important. And he worked in both veins from youth to old age. In charging classical themes with his own feelings and ideas, Tennyson was especially in the Keatsian tradition. Okay, the poem Ulysses, as you can see, it was considered to be the finest in purity of composition and in the drawing of character among Tennyson's dramatic monologue. The poem was written in October 1833. It's the hardcore Victorian period, that is to be specific. Now, what happens, that Tennyson had a friend whose name was Arthur Hallam. And as we know that after the death of Arthur Hallam, Tennyson was very much, in a broken situation, because somehow some near and dear ones actually passed away. And certainly that actually left a big, impact on some characters and also on us. And certainly just like what Tennyson actually had felt at the time, that he was also feeling dejected. He was also feeling somehow the kind of, the negative impacts were always within his life at that very moment. So the question certainly was, and that's why that a famous poem by Lord Tennyson, that is In Memoriam, was written after the death of Arthur Hallam. It was it's a pastoral elegy, to be specific. Now, what happens to be specific, that when Tennyson was considering, when Tennyson was thinking whether I will leave the remaining part of my life in such a kind of, kind of despairing note or not, or maybe I will be revived into something new. that particular orientation, that particular temperament, one particular reference to the faith, and then the doubt about whether you will be capable or not in taking the life in its real terms or something. So that particular orientation can also be found to be present in Ulysses here. Okay, I will talk about that later, that how Tennyson's Ulysses had changed, and it has been tinged in the color of Tennyson's own temperament. What happens that soon after Tennyson heard of the death of his gifted friend Arthur Hallam in Vienna, he was engaged to the poet's sister Emily. Okay, he said of it. There is a particular line that have been being quoted here. There is more about myself in Ulysses. Remember the lines. There is more about myself in Ulysses, which was written under the sense of loss, because Hallam was dead, and all that had gone by, but that still life must be fought out to the end. So that is the particular temperament you see. That at one moment there is a despairing notion because the real friend is dead, and now you are also thinking in terms of the fate. At one point there is the doubt regarding the possibilities of life. At another point there is the fate that is working on, because you have to fight till the end. So that very different orientation, or maybe the contrasting orientation, is always in work with this particular poet. It was more written with the feeling of this loss upon me than many poems in memoriam. Okay, Ulysses was first published in 1842 in the second volume of the collection of his poems, like Break, Break, Break and the Two Voices. It expresses the poet's feeling about the need of going forward at one point and facing life despite the bereavement he had suffered. So at one point it is pointing towards the despairs, the kind of bereavement that he was suffering from regarding the death of Arthur Hallam, who was his closest friend at the time. And at another level it is referring to the going forward. That means Charoi Beti. You see that in spite of different kinds of problems and tussles and different kinds of, the various kinds of obstacles that you are facing, but you have to move forward. And that is the temperament with which the poem has actually been working on. Now, Ulysses, as I've already mentioned, it is being pointed out here that is a Greek hero whose heroic deeds and adventures are sung by Homer in Odyssey. And Tennyson quoted both Odyssey 9, line number 100 to 137, and the Divine Comedy that I've mentioned just now regarding Dante. It is line number 1265 to 1321. It is in the Inferno section 26, obviously, as his sources. So if you try to identify the source regarding this poem, or source for this poem, you will find at one moment it is Homer's Odyssey, and at another moment it is Dante's Divine Comedy, and to be specific, it is Inferno section 26. Now, the question certainly arises how Dante's Inferno is contributing to the presentation of Ulysses. Where lies the difference? That was the question that actually I asked beforehand. What happens, that Dante's Inferno, it contains a description of this voyage and its sequel. You know what happened to Dante's Inferno? And in Divine Comedy, I have mentioned that in Divine Comedy, Dante was, when Beatrice was dead, that is Dante's beloved, and when after the death of Beatrice, Dante had felt at the time that certainly I did not pay proper love or proper compassion to my beloved, and he actually felt that I must be sorry to her, and I must apologize in front of her just because of my infidelity, just because of my, to some extent, quote-unquote, cruel behavior and something. And now, after the death of Beatrice, Dante was preparing for a journey in an alive situation. That means he was a living creature, he was a living man, but mentally he was considering that I must apologize in front of Beatrice. So in the poem Divine Comedy, Dante actually constitutes a journey, a mental journey towards heaven while he remained alive. He's not dead. Okay? So that journey is Divine Comedy. So generally, in that particular path to heaven, when he meets Beatrice, there is particular three differentiations of that particular life being incorporated. One, it is called the Inferno or hell. Second, it is considered as Purgatorio, that is called the place of purgation, when the soul will be purgated. And by, the different rivers are there. There is river Achiran or Achiran. There is river Lide, L-E-T-H-E. There is the river Unoi, okay, and the river Styx. So there are different references to the rivers. And after that, after the Purgatorio, he attains the Paradiso when he meets Beatrice and apologizes. So in this particular voyage, or rather in this particular journey, Dante had encountered different things, you see. Okay, the souls, the spirits, the lost violent souls. Okay, so generally you will find that this particular reference to Dante's Divine Comedy or Inferno, it has been pointed out by Tennyson that what he felt regarding Ulysses or Odysseus. So that's why here it has been pointed out that Dante's Inferno, it contains a description of this voyage and its sequel. Tennyson took the idea of the voyage of Ulysses from Inferno. So that particular idea of committing the second voyage and something, and the allegorical representation that I have just pointed out in the topic section. So that is the reason why Tennyson is using them. So it is a kind of a, you will find that the idea of the voyage of Ulysses, it is taken from Inferno and modeled his hero on Homer's. So therefore you see that the hero and the temperament of the hero, the temperament of the character, it is taken from Homer, but the idea of voyage, the idea of the basic orientations of different kinds of allegorical significance, these are taken from Inferno by Dante, literally. There is a reference to a critic, his name is W.W. Robson. He writes, I'm quoting actually, Tennyson's Ulysses is Homer's Odysseus fell through Dante. So remember the line? I repeat, Tennyson's Ulysses that we are reading, it is Homer's Odysseus fell through Dante. That means a kind of, Dante is becoming a kind of a prism. So ultimately, the character of Ulysses that is propounded by Homer, it got certainly changed through the prism, through Dantean representation. And now it is been Tennyson's Ulysses that have been placed in a typical Victorian representation. So Tennyson's Ulysses is Homer's Odysseus fell through Dante. But the vibration of this poem of Tennyson is not due merely to a modern poet's response to the Renaissance. The emotion to which it gives this dramatic expression is something personal to the poet. Remember after Halam episode that I have mentioned just now? So it is not simply the Victorian orientation that is working within the presentation of the character Ulysses. Rather, you will find certainly this is also indicating towards the poet's representation, what the poet was feeling at the time. The hope and despair, obviously. The faith and doubt that was essential to the Victorianism also. So ultimately, you will find in the presentation of Ulysses, to some extent, Tennyson's representation is also another important part. The emotion to which it gives this dramatic expression is something personal to the poet as a man alive in this particular poem. Generally, what happens, that Tennyson's Ulysses is based on a description in a passage in Dante's Inferno, okay, which translated in English in this particular way. I'm quoting from that particular section. It has been pointed out that I'm reading the particular section what is being written in Dante's Inferno regarding Ulysses. It states, neither fondness of my son, okay, nor the due love which ought to have gladdened Penelope. Penelope was the wife of Ulysses or Odysseus, could conquer in me the ardor which I had to become experienced in the world and in human vice and worth. So Ulysses or Odysseus couldn't find anything that can suit his temperament. No familial obligations, no love from Penelope, no fatherly feelings or filial obligations that have been associated with Telemachus, his son. Nothing could consider or nothing could actually suffice Ulysses' temperament or Ulysses' hankering or something. So that's why it says, I put out into the deep open sea with but one ship, and with that small company which had not deserted me. I and my companions were old and tardy when we came to that narrow pass where Hercules assigned his landmarks. That is the Straits of Gibraltar, actually. Oh, brothers, I said, who through 1,000 dangers have reached the west, deny not this so brief the vigil of your senses that remain experience of the unpeopled world beyond the sun. That means you will remain a true companions to me, and fundamentally it is another kind of journey. We will no longer stop ourselves within the close, periphery of our familial obligations. We have to commit another journey. Okay, so therefore it says, your brothers who through 1,000 dangers have reached the west, deny not this so brief the vigil of your senses that remain, experience of the unpeopled world beyond the sun. Consider your origin. You were not formed to live like brutes, but to follow virtue and knowledge. So that was the thing that here is being pointed out in Dantes Inferno. That was the temperament of the poet. That was the temperament of Ulysses being pointed out here. Tennyson, how Tennyson is changing that particular thing. You see that Tennyson has made some alteration in the story. It is a critic actually has pointed out. His name is Paul Turner. He says that Dante puts Ulysses in hell for the sin of fraud. Why fraud? Because inventing the Trojan horse. We know that in the Trojan War, Odysseus was the solely responsible for creating the Trojan horse, and we know that in between in midst of the horse, the soldiers were actually kept hidden, and ultimately they have been transferred to Troy, and at night they are coming from there and they are fighting from your side. So generally, it is not the true cause. You see, it is not the true way of fighting. Okay. So generally, it's a kind of a scene of fraud, and that's why Dante actually puts Ulysses in hell, where he relates the story of his death at sea on a last voyage. So there also a particular reference is being incorporated by Dante, that when Dante, the living soul, actually met Ulysses there, Ulysses prefigured, or Ulysses told Dante, the soul, that he was dead when he had committed the last journey. Okay, so now what happens, undertaken, it was the journey or the last voyage was undertaken because his passion for exploration overcomes his feeling for son, father, and wife. So all the familial obligations have been negated, and he actually succumbed to the exploration motive, and therefore he moved there. He recalls how he urged his few faithful companions not refuse experience of the uninhabited world behind the sun. So that's why that in the process of exploration, he was to, gather experience, the newer one, and something, the adventurous orientations is being incorporated. And he didn't think about his mariners to deprive them of such a kind of experience that he was going to gather, but to employ the brief possessions of their faculties as a human being should in following mainly virtue and knowledge. In his composite portrait of Ulysses, that was the temperament of Ulysses that had been propounded by by Dante in his Inferno. Now, in the portraiture of Ulysses, Tennyson has fused varied influence ranging from Homer to Byron through Dante and Shakespeare. What emerges in the end is a recognizable heroic, though bewildered figure, a permanent and influential contribution to the Ulysses myth that has been spoken by W.B. Stanford. So in different times we find in the different formations of writing, different authors have referred to Ulysses with different orientations. And now we have found a new Ulysses has begun, has taken birth in the hand of Lord Tennyson. So, it's a big contribution to the myth of Ulysses, therefore. In style and language, it may also be contrasted with Enon. And Tennyson's Ulysses, in fact, an embodiment of the modern passion for knowledge that is also significant, as I've already mentioned. that in this particular poem you will find a continuous reference to somehow the typical Victorian appeal is in work. So therefore the modern passion for knowledge, for the exploration of its limitless fields, for the annexation of new kingdom of science and thought, so all these temperaments can be associated with the Victorian orientation or the typical works of Victorianism, to be specific. The entire poem is put into the mouth of Ulysses, as you can find here, the hero of Homer's Odyssey. And according to that epic, he returned at last from his wanderings to native Ithaca. But Tennyson makes him express dissatisfaction with a life of inactivity and yearning to set out again in search of adventures. That Ulysses left his home a second time in order to gain more experience of life, and the world was already imagined from Dante's Divine Comedy. So it was the reference to Divine Comedy as I mentioned just now. In this connection, there is another critic, his name is Charlton Collins. He observes that the germ of the spirit and the sentiment of this poem are from 26th canto of Dantes Inferno, as is usual with him in all cases where he borrows. The details and minuter portions of the work are his own. He has added grace, elaboration, symmetry. He has called in the assistance of other poets, particularly Homer and Virgil. A rough carbon draft has been metamorphosed into a perfect picture in the presentation of Ulysses by Lord Alfred Tennyson. And at the last, we should say that though in form the poem is a dramatic monologue with which we have actually began this particular discussion, modern discussions have treated it from the author's point of view, which decided its forms and called it a soliloquy. Okay, in place of dramatic monologue, it's been placed by the modern writers as soliloquy, expressing the Victorian spirit of compromise. It is taken from the critic F. Brie, B-R-I-E, or it is being considered that indicative of Tennyson's muddled thinking reflected in the poem's structural inconsistencies, or reflecting in jovial agnosticism in contradistinction of the faith avowed in memoriam. Some have called the poem an interior monologue, that is the utterance of a superannuated hero, the retired hero, indulging himself in the fantasy that his beloved mariners are still alive. And therefore, it is a dream, therefore, you see, because I have already mentioned it's an allegorical framework that have been associated with this particular poem. And we know that mythologically, or, you know, in this particular journey, there was no particular presence of the mariners in reality. So therefore, it should be considered as a dream also. And somehow it's providing a means of temporary escape from the uncongenial reality of Ithaca. You are just facing, you are not trying to face the problems of Ithaca, rather you are trying to enter into another adventurous world. So somehow that particular escaping notion or the escaping orientation or the orientation of an escapist is always being associated with the classification of this particular poem truly. To others, opposed to ignoring the dramatic element, it is considered as a lyric, a key with which Tennyson unlocked his art. If the poem is read as a dramatic piece, the speaker becomes a highly complex individual with superb poetic and dramatic skill. A most interesting critical opinion treats Ulysses as a soliloquy presented as a dramatic monologue in which Ulysses seeks self-oblivion in death. Thus, his voyage is a preparation for death, and his objective is realization of spiritual reality. Now, that particular concept is being provided by a critic. His name is V. Satchidanandan. So, fundamentally, wherever you will go with the interpretation of this particular poem, there are obviously different orientation to it. There is obvious references whether this Ulysses is actually resembling Homer's Ulysses or not, or maybe what are the basic differences that Dante actually originated in his Divine Comedy, that is the Inferno, and how Tennyson got influenced with that particular form. And at the same time, you will find that how Tennyson actually changed that very mythological Ulysses into a Victorian Ulysses of his own. Okay, it is not the typical Victorianism, but his own temperament that got reflected in the presentation of Victorian, Ulysses' psyche. And at the same time, as we can consider this is a poem of escape, or rather it's a kind of a soliloquy or a dramatic monologue, or maybe it should be considered that Ulysses is an allegorical poem that actually discusses on a particular formations of symbolic dream journey that is indicating towards the life hereafter, that is the attaining of spiritual reality, to be specific. So all these are found to be present in this particular poem, and we will continue this particular discussion and discuss each and every details of this particular poem. Not today, it is in our next class. Okay.